what that means is that they really want you, and so you can pay the price. And so they come back and then second time and look at the space and talk to the grad students to see what kind of grad students you're going to have once you set up the lab. Talk to the postdocs to see what kind of postdocs you might be able to attract once you have the lab there, and see if you'll get enough space. And then there was a question about junior faculty. The key thing is talk to the junior faculty at that institution to see how they're being treated, whether their senior faculty are reading your grant proposals and giving back good feedback, or just totally blowing you off after they hire you, and so on. So those are the things that you need to do. So I also am just an advertisement involved in. So I don't know if people know, but I was working with a LEAD program on campus, and that's to increase diversity in STEM, science, technology, engineering, mathematics disciplines. And we've been running a lecture series. So we had Donna Nelson, a chemist, Native American chemist, come to give a talk in the spring. And the next speaker is actually Claude Canizares from MIT. And what you can see is that he is a professor of physics, and he's the vice provost for research and also associate provost at MIT. And the reason he was invited and actually recommended to me was that he's now co-chairing the committee to study gender differences in careers of STEM faculty. And this is sponsored by the National Academy of Sciences and the NRC, which will be the National Research Council, and they about to publish a report on the gender differences, and he'll be coming and talking about some of the findings. And so we have an informal lunch, and the reason this is not out is I have not been able to get a title for his talk from him up to this point. But there's a lunch happening next Thursday. The food's provided 11:30 to 1:30, and it basically to come and meet him and talk to him about the gender and diversity issues among the faculty. And he'll have a lot of hard data to talk about, and he'll be happy to meet with grad students and postdocs. So if you do that, that'd be great. And then he's given a talk about those findings at 3:30 in the General Auditorium.
Are there any more questions for Tintin? Okay. Thank Tintin. And
while we're doing the change up, by all means, have some more pizza. We have plenty left.
Our last speaker is David Zappulla. He's a postdoc in Chem Biochem. He's in Tom Check's lab. And he just this past job in the season was on the market and had a position at the biology department at Johns Hopkins. So he can tell you about his perspective on applying for jobs, what the interview's like, and what he thinks is important tips for us if we're going to be applying for a job soon. And just we'll wait a few minutes while people are getting their pizza. Okay.
So you want 7 So when you get interviewed, still thinking about that. Okay, so yeah, it's great to hear Tintin and John's
input, and I'll probably reiterate a bunch of the things. I know I'll reiterate a bunch of the things they said. Probably if all three of us say it, it's probably that obviously important. But some of the stuff I'll cover is more detailed, and I apologize for sort of the MCDB type slant for those of you who are in other fields, even on biochemistry or biology stuff. So yeah, it's a tough time to get a job, but I guess it's always tough. And sort of this is some sort of ivory tower with a bright rainbow over it. This is how, like a postdoc's view of job searching or something. Okay, so and feel free to chime in with questions anytime, and maybe please, John and Tintin, feel free to help respond, or if you see anything that I got that on my slides that I got the job for in spite of, please mention it. Okay, so some prerequisites before, when you're thinking about probably around this stage, you know, am I ready, and so forth. One thing that's a total prerequisite is your postdoc advisor is ready for you to go on the search tour, because it's very time consuming. I don't know if it's true necessarily, but it certainly these days seems to take a ton of time. Most successful searches that I've heard about, people apply to a lot of jobs, unless you're just, you know, multiple top-tier journal publications kind of candidate. A lot of people who are getting jobs are applying to 50 or even over 100 jobs. So that being said, another thing you really need is 4 or 5 willing and ready references, at least in the field I'm in. Most places ask for 3 or 4 referees, but you might want to have a 5th one in the wings who's kind of got a heads up that you might need them. Although I didn't end up needing a 5th this year at all. You need publications. It's interesting to see that letters may be even slightly more important, although I'm sure both are crucial. And in at least decent journals, some people get jobs with just 1 paper, so it need not be tons of them, but I'm sure the more the merrier. You'll need time to spare for the process, as I mentioned. I would say it's incredibly time consuming. It's a part-time thing, but it can become exponentially more time consuming if you're having success, if you start flying around for interviews. I've heard of people flying to over 20 interviews, so you can imagine that they're not doing anything else. I personally had 4 first interviews, and even that took a lot of time. Research plans, this is a daunting task, I think, at the early stages, because you need to have sort of short-term research plans that are grant-worthy in the short term, and then also long-term conceptual and even specific aims for 5 to 10 years out. That'll be crucial at the interview stage, I think, more than anything, when people start probing your long-term future plans. So this will take some time, and you probably want to work on the research plan aspect months in advance of getting started with, starting to send in applications. You probably need to, just to develop that part of the application. And then I think, as people have mentioned already, presentations at meetings. If you're applying to a job that has a significant teaching component, some experience with this, or at least training or something like that, it all helps. And then deep knowledge of literature, but also noteworthy breadth of understanding of multiple disciplines, so that you have options and can teach multiple topics and so forth. I think it's also useful. So where to start? This is a bit specific, but it's actually a significant component of the whole search process, in my opinion, because organizing the ads and finding them is a lot of work, and a lot of the time spent is on this. So one place that I think my top choice for looking for ads was in science, and their website, sciencecareers.org. You'll set up an account, and you can get emailed every week or whatever the new jobs that have popped up that meet your search criteria. I used keywords like professor or faculty, and I don't think I missed much using those words, but every week or two I'd probably read the unabridged list of all job ads on the website, which takes probably an hour or something. Nature also, they have their own dedicated website. There's more non-US focused, a lot more Europe and elsewhere covered there, so if you're interested in international jobs, definitely look there. And then sciencejobs.com is used by Self-Press, at least it was when I was searching, and that's a third place that also had a lot of ads. But usually if they pop up in here, they're usually in science too, so that's why I put science. Let's see. So then there are occasionally these random little job ads that you find in smaller specialty journals, or just that weren't advertised as prominently. And I can't say that that's where I found a job that led to a successful interview for myself, but it's probably worth looking through your own specialty journals for things, and also looking on specific departmental websites. Maybe you'll see them there before they pop up in literature. Okay, so then compiling them, I mean, what I was doing was just pasting the ads that interested me out of science or whatever off the web into a Word file, organizing them by due date. And this is, for me this year, this was like 90 ads, which is like 30 pages of text or something like that. So it does add up, and you'll just be about to send out your October 1st batch or something, and then suddenly 2 more ads pop up a week before the first, and so it has to be very plastic, and you have to be ready to paste new ones in, and suddenly get those ready to go out. Occasionally you can send something in late and still get an interview. That happened to me in one case. But obviously I would imagine the sooner the better. I can't imagine you could send in your application too early. I'm sure having it sitting there alone on someone's desk for months in advance can only be good, but only if it's really ready. In my case, I sent them out usually a few days before, like they were always there on time, but not necessarily weeks in advance. Yeah, so, right, I mentioned that I had about probably 90 ads, and I had a previous year of searching where I came up empty, and I probably had 50 ads that year, last year and a half ago or so. So I did strike out entirely 1 year, and I think that's pretty common, especially the first year. So you almost have to imagine that it's likely that you'll search at least 1 year before succeeding. Not necessarily always the case, though. So John and Tintin covered this a bit. So CV, obviously the basics are crucial, and this is obviously a critical part of the whole application. One part that they won't mention in the ad, but which is obviously required, is the cover letter. In my case, it was basically 1 page in all cases, unless the address was really long and spilled into the second page. Or if they asked for me to describe teaching foci or whatever, and that wasn't really that prominent in the research and teaching component of the application, then I would comment on it for a paragraph in the cover letter. If they don't mention teaching, I didn't bring it up in the cover letter. Teaching is probably a tricky thing to predict how you're going to be received with respect to that if you're going to or applying for a job that has both components, which most of them do. Let's see. So yeah, so the research plan, in my case, it was about 4 pages, and I had 2 figures with like preliminary unpublished data. Actually, one of them was actually published results, but I thought it would spice up the research plan to have some data, because scientists like data. And for unpublished results, if it was something new and exciting, it seemed like a good place to throw that out there and describe why it was useful and what I was going to do with it. Okay, so sending it, this is seemingly trivial, but it took up a lot of your time also, and money. So things are changing too in this regard. So a lot of ads will ask for it by mail or by email. Some places ask for it by both ways. Specifically, some give you both choices and leave it vague. I don't know if it really makes any difference how you provide it, as long as it's on time. But I ended up, because of the timing, I ended up sending most of mine priority mail, which is something like $4 an application. So you can see how it adds up, and you spend a lot of time just assembling these things in the post office every couple of weeks. And I mentioned that even if you had everything ready in August, not all the ads are out yet, so you're going to have to do this multiple trips, because job ads keep popping up in literature from the season, from August through January even, some of which are interesting even through the month of January. But at the same time, some people are getting interviews in November, and some job ads just simply aren't following that calendar necessarily. Yeah, and then in some cases it's only provided by email. That's all they leave is an email address, and that's probably the quickest way to have to provide it. And in some cases, like Rockefeller or somewhere, they have websites where you upload each or paste in each set of materials. And sometimes these have, like, if they're pasted in, it'll cut you off at a certain word limit or space limit. So you're like, uh-oh, there's no fudging here. I can't even get in that last paragraph. So that can take a lot of time because you have to tailor it to exactly how they break down the application. So be ready for that. With respect to interviewing, the public talk, I presume this is really a crucial part of the interview process. I'm not sure that it's more important than a chalk talk. It's probably equally so for those in the field where a chalk talk is something you'll do as well. But certainly you're going to do this, and certainly it's very important. One bit of advice I was given was to give an outline of the talk, like what I'm going to talk about, break it down. It's an hour-long talk usually, so you really want to kind of make it very digestible. Make sure you have like a summary at the end. Talk about maybe if it's a teaching institution, you could mention teaching at the end. I didn't end up doing that actually, but future directions, that sort of thing. Acknowledgement is probably important too. Let's see. So, and then practice your talk. Get a lot of feedback from people who aren't in your field, not just your lab, your postdoc lab, for example, so that you get a sense of whether it's understandable, is it clear, is it concise, don't go over time. And then, yeah, so practice, you can't really over practice unless you're so bored that you know the whole thing verbatim and you can't even deliver it with enthusiasm because you're so burned out on it. And then definitely be ready for interruptions. Some places where I gave talks, there were, the place was packed with undergraduates and they were asking all these great questions like right during my talk and not even necessarily raising their hand, just spouting out, which is exciting, but it also will delay you. So I almost ran over time there. In fact, I couldn't even talk about future directions because there were about 5 to 10 minutes of questions during my talk. So be ready for anything, basically. I mean, you might even have this contingency plan, like PowerPoint projector's broken, what do you do? That seems pretty absurd, but you never know. And then in some cases, you might want to have like some new bit of data that you couldn't even fit into your regular talk because there's no time, or that you choose not to put in there because you'd like to save it for the chalk talk. I think that might be a smart move. If it's something new and breaking new ground that you're going to build on for future directions, that ended up happening to me this year, but not 2 years ago. And then, yeah, questions, I imagine, and it was good to hear that this is certainly important, and it's something that you never be too good at. I think it's quite an art. Just listening to people's questions very carefully, making sure you really understand it, and then not talking about something else, being a politician, but just like answering that question as clearly and quickly as you can. And then if there's room for introducing other things during that period, like, oh, and never mind, in a related topic, blah, 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 if you want to bring up new things. You might want to even have certain topics that you want to bring up in the Q&A after your seminar, because you presume someone's going to ask something related. Even extra slides at the end of your talk that you don't bring up until someone asks you that question. Okay, and then the chalk talk, for those of you who will have to give one, I presume is still absolutely crucial for getting the job. And importantly, and I'm sure that this is the case, you probably don't have practice at this, and I know I didn't. And it's a totally different talk where you're in collegial space, there's no public audience, and they're going to just barrage you with questions if you're doing it, if they want to, which usually they do. And usually that's a good sign. If they're all asking you questions, that's probably good if you can answer them. So outline the important aims. You probably won't be able to use any slides, really, maybe one. My plan in general was not to have any slides, just to start talking and use the board and chalk and all that stuff that you'll be using in the future. And again, you want to give this practice talk to diverse audiences as well. For example, here I gave it to the postdoc group, and got all this great feedback before I went on the circuit, and it was just days before I went out, and it was really helpful. So I imagine we can do that sort of thing in this forum again. Let's see. So yeah, be ready to fill 45 minutes or so with just talking about your future aims and your work, because they might not interrupt you at all for 40 minutes. It's possible. It did happen to me once at one place 2 years ago, and I was just surprised that there was all this dead air time, and so I had to fill it, and eventually, ran out of things to say, and that was a learning experience. So I thought it was good to start off with an intro that sort of talks about your interests and your excitement about certain topics right at the beginning, and then segue into details, but sort of starting out with some sort of integrating, overlying topic can be useful. And yeah, and be ready to answer questions from left field at that time about whatever. I mean, they can ask you all sorts of things. Usually it relates to grants, what your lab's going to be like in 5 years, that kind of thing. And teaching also could be covered at that time. So interviewing, the actual process during the day when you're just meeting back to back with faculty all day, sometimes for several days, can be exhausting. If you're doing multiple interviews back to back, if you're so lucky, then it gets really exhausting because sometimes they're just a day between a stint of 3 days somewhere. And sometimes if you're on the coast, for example, like if you're in California, you'd be flying, always into a different time zone. From here, we'd fly moderately into both time zones, or all three, but never 3 hours off, which helps. And then you have to be prepared to meet with each of these people and listen to them basically and discuss with them their research. So it's good to prepare to talk about their work, have questions in your head, and also be ready to field questions, on the turn of a dime about your own work, and questions about the school in general and so forth. The most common thing that is going to happen when you walk into people's offices is they're going to say, do you have any questions? And it's going to happen 12 times in a row or so you better have at least 12 good questions and space them out because you'll run out eventually, which is inevitable. I mean, sometimes by the 12th visit, you're like, well, I've kind of gotten them all answered, but you should still be able to have more. And they should be good questions and not off topic, or they shouldn't be really unrelated to science, for example, in the first interview. Okay, and then, yeah, so that sort of gets into this. I don't know what other people think, but I try to always keep discussions on topic or on science, unless it was a second interview and they're trying to recruit you and they're just telling you how great the schools are in the neighborhood and stuff. Then you can certainly get into that. And then I've been giving good advice to bring little snacks and things. And I swear you'll miss lunch like all the time because you'll go to lunch technically, but be with like 10 grad students or something, and they're just barraging you with questions the whole time, and you don't end up getting to eat more than 2 bites. So you might want to have something packed away and take bathroom breaks and bring a water bottle. And then dinner. I mean, this is where you're sort of in collegial space again. You want to probably be sociable, but not too sociable, and fit in, and it's a challenge. But usually there's discussion of science at these things, and it's almost like some sort of like, can you tolerate alcohol and talk about science at the same time? And so that's like where you don't drink too much, and that's always sort of a tricky thing. They offer you something first, and you're like, are you guys drinking? But I'm sure if you're just, friendly and agreeable and go with the flow, that I'm sure it's fine. Second interview, if you're lucky enough to get to this stage, there's a whole bunch of totally different. The thing is totally different now, but it's not totally different either. So you still got to be a nice person. You still got to be a colleague they want to have, of course. And hopefully you wouldn't be the kind of person who would get all nasty and be like, you've got to give me this. But at the same time, it's really your only chance to kind of ask for what you need, and set the bar a little higher than it would have been if they were just going to let you waltz in under their terms. So I don't know, some of the things that worked for me were just asking questions, not necessarily making any demands, but just saying, you know, what about this? How does this work? Or, you know, what kind of funds are available? You know, just feel things out. That was my MO. And then certainly keep asking people advice. You know, your people above you who've been through this will certainly know how it works at schools and in departments. And, from the postdoc perspective, we really can't imagine how things are perceived sometimes. So certainly talk to people. This is just a summary slide, but maybe we should just, I'd be happy to take questions. You guys have been pretty quiet. I know it's been almost 2 hours, but I'll answer anything. So.
So this kind of relates to letters, you know. I've heard before too that it's good to have 5 people who can write you good letters just in case somebody's on sabbatical or, you know, you can't get a letter from them.
Right.
And so of course, you know, you can think of 2 immediately who those could be your thesis advisor, your postdoc advisor. Well, this is a question for all 3 of you guys. Where's a good place to get those other letters? How do you get people to know you well?
I mean, these guys can probably speak to this better, but what I had heard was that it's probably better to have more letters from your postdoc time because it's more recent. And yeah.
Usually you can find like good victims in like journal clubs, you know, super group meetings, collaborators with your postdoc advisor if they, you know, did the work. And also, it's never too late to start getting them to get to know you. So, you know, don't show up 2 weeks before the letter is due and say, can you write me a letter? But it's good to start establishing a relationship with them so that they know you. Because they might get sort of intelligent.
Yeah, collaborators maybe, if you have collaborators even at other schools or people you got to know at meetings, especially if they're like, you know, in Europe or something, it would probably increase the impact of your letters if they're from even overseas. You could impress someone across the ocean or something.
Can you elaborate a little on like how do you figure out what you need to ask for in terms of startup funds?
Yeah,
having never gone through that process.
It's funny because you get all absorbed in the interview and the other earlier stage things, and then suddenly you actually get an offer, and you're like, oh my god, that's like a whole nother. I mean, that takes a lot of thought and a lot of preparedness, and, but usually you have a couple weeks to really cram on, what your lab's going to look like, and so forth. In my case. So I'm a K99 ROO awardee, and I found out about that grant while I was interviewing, actually right before I went to the first interview. And so obviously that's like an R01 grant, and so there's my grant writing experience. But that totally changed how I designed my lab, because now I have this X amount of money, almost, I mean not for sure, but it's sort of lined up. And then, so yeah, you kind of have to be ready to say how you're going to use money, no matter where it comes from, who you're going to hire, in what order, what project they might work on. I don't think there's an easy answer other than sitting down and thinking about it really hard.
Are there any other resources for just what things cost? Like what does a technician cost? What does a grad student cost?
Yeah, to a large extent, it's like the Fisher catalog, and in terms of personnel, yeah, you can talk to OCG here. I mean, I was working with them extensively on my grant, and so I'd already figured out how to spend it. So that helped. Again, you know, even if you aren't sure you get it, I think applying for one of these long grants from NIH is really good practice, because if you're going to be writing NIH grants, probably, or NSF. I don't know if there's something similar for people in other fields, but.
There's a detailed budget page you have to
Yeah,
fill in,
yeah,
so you have those numbers.
yeah, and usually you're working with the on-campus grants office with that, and they're asking you, well, who are you going to hire, and you know, when, and how long are you going to stay, and they can tell you all the details about how much they cost, and infringement or whatever benefits, all that. So you'll be talking about the future institution, but at least you'll have a guideline.
It's a good chance to pitch one of our workshops later in the semester. On November 14th, we're doing a workshop on writing grants. We're going to have Randy Draper, who's the director of the Office of Contracts and Grants. He's going to come and talk a little bit about this process. He's going to speak a little bit about how you can find this type of information out. And they actually have a lot of resources over there to help people. Human resources is probably also a good place to get information about like how much technicians cost and grad students. You get that information from the department, I imagine.
If I might add too, this is something you can ask during the interviewing process. When they ask about questions, you can ask how much does a student ask, and then what's the overhead rate that you pay at the institution? Is there an off-campus overhead rate? If the money comes back to the department, is that something you'd waive to have for starting up a program?
One thing I got that was very useful was actually an Excel file of the equipment list of someone who started a lab a few years before me. And that had prices attached to it. And then there was a matter of updating some of that. So, because, you just don't think about like how many pairs of forceps do you buy? How many refrigerators do you buy? What kind of freezers, all of that. So I just went off it, even though I didn't buy exactly the same thing, it's close enough that it's useful.
Yeah, talking to young faculty, especially, all levels of faculty, you just have to start discussing things with faculty in your department and in other departments. Even just 2 minutes of their time sometimes is a total gem. So, and they can also talk to you about teaching mode and what's important. So just talking to them gives you good questions and informed questions for when you interview. Yeah.
So you said in the first that 4 or 5 references letters be ready. So what do you mean by that? So the letter writers wrote your reference already, and then
pretty much, yeah. That they definitely are willing, and they've basically got it done. Because you want to give them, definitely it seems like you have to really help your letter writers out. Because if people are starting to apply to 100 jobs, that is incredible. I can only imagine what the burden is like. So yeah, tell them early and give them information that they could use, make it easy for them to put their letter together.
so you give them the address, contact information for the place you applied for, so that they can send the
right.
letter.
So that's I tried to cover it on one of the slides, but that's like where a ton of work and time comes in on your part, and you really want to take the onus off of them to have to keep track of, did I send that letter or not? You want to give them lists with addresses, they can paste it right into their letter. Or what I did actually was, so your letter writers are often not on campus, so they're your thesis advisor from wherever. What I was doing was mailing them pre-printed labels to slap on a letter, on an envelope, so that they didn't have to do that either. Mailing the letters, I had my thesis advisor send me stationery from their school so that I could pre-write out the address on the envelopes and then mail the envelopes back to them in batches. Because a lot of PIs don't have that much help in terms of just paperwork, and it definitely takes up time.
It might be the field. I write a lot of letters of recommendation, and I don't think I've ever written more than about 30 per person.
Yeah,
So
yeah.
if it was more than that, I would probably be screaming. You need to reduce the number of places.
Yeah, this year it was probably 70, and I know that a guy got a job recently in our department and applied to 110.
Yeah. As a letter writer, I would try to convince them that's too many.
Yeah, I'm sure I will too. Yeah. But it's sort of this, it seems like some sort of sad reality of the current bottleneck.
I have a question for Tintin and John as potential letter writers about reminders. How often should, if we're asking to write me a letter, is it considered passive see if I were to email you maybe a week before it was due, and then maybe a couple days later to see if you sent it, or is that a good thing?
Well, in my field, I work with large groups of people, like 100 people in my experiment. And so I ask people to tell me when it's due, and I tell them that I will send them a response when I send in the letter. So they haven't got it, they know that I'm not doing the job. And then I think you can respond. But I think if I was getting something regularly to say, have you done this? I wouldn't like that.
And also, I don't know that I would trust a faculty member if they said it. No, seriously. And so I think the best thing is actually to check with the recipient end. And usually, like in our department, the administrative assistant made sure that every file had 3 letters. And if there was one missing, then she'll tell me, and I email the person who was supposed to have written it and had it. So I think people get really confused about what they wrote and what they didn't after a while. They think they've sent it, but there was one person who kept insisting they already sent it. Okay, the 3rd time, it's not here yet, so just email it.
But, personally, if I had to write like 100 letters, I couldn't remember what I had done.
No.
Yeah, that's why you really have to be in charge of your everything. Like,
I have a question. You at the beginning, at the title of your talk, you said multiple postdocs. The postdoctoral experiences, multiple. I guess.
oh, I did. I guess there's just sometimes there are multiple. I would.
Yeah. Well, how important to do multiple? I mean, to get multiple postdoctoral experiences.
Yeah.
I mean, some people now, there was a recent debate that Princeton Chemistry Department, for example, offered a job to a Harvard senior graduate student.
Yeah.
I mean, how important is it?
I think it still happens in probably every field, but it seems exceedingly rare in the field I'm in. Exceedingly rare. I can name a couple examples, but anyway, it does happen, but I think it's quite rare. And usually you're in like a lead, you're already an expert in a hot field if that happens. Probably they don't want you to waste, whatever, like not have a lab because you have so many incredible things that need to be done or something.
I might add that, I mean, in my discipline, it's more and more common for people to have 2 postdocs. I mean, they have 2 different postdoc positions before they are finding a job. If you're on the theory side, then people are looking earlier because it's harder to find a job on the theory side. And the last couple people that we've hired have accepted the job and then stayed on with their postdoc for another year. So what that means is that, if you find jobs that you'd really like to apply for, I would encourage you to apply for them. So if you get them, you can still, most institutions are going to say, fine, if you want to finish your postdoc for another year, that's fine. If you say, I want to do it for 2 years, we'll say, forget it. But if you say, just for a year, I want to finish up what I'm working on, I think almost every institution would be all right with that.
You defer?
Deferring, yeah, I deferred. I ended up deferring. But
Any more questions for any of our speakers?
I can say there's one other thing I just thought of when he mentioned that he deferred. So we haven't talked about if you get the job in the tenure process, but almost every institution will give you credit for teaching you've done towards tenure. So sometimes people want the full 6 or 7 years to get tenure. But you can shorten the process. So if you happen to be staying on for a year and you were to teach a course during that time, an institution will probably give you credit for a year of teaching. So you might have had a longer postdoctoral experience, but you might shorten the time to tenure.
How long is too long? So is it sponsorship?
I think, well, I would say it really depends on what school that you're applying for. I think at most of the, I would say top flight schools, I would say typically 5 years is sort of the end. If you're after that, then you're probably looking for younger people to come in because it gets stretched out. You know, it takes 6 or 7 years to get tenure, so you get to be pretty old.
Oh, yeah. I applied at a 6-year job. I think that's maybe the upper limit. The other thing that's important is if you stay long as a postdoc, but then have something to show for, that's usually the length becomes a non-issue. You know, but if you stay for too long and have as many publications as someone who is only a postdoc for half the time, that's a problem. So sometimes there's a reason to stay because of the nature of the project, and then you finish off and publish a lot towards the end, which is actually what happened to me, and so that was fine. But I don't think there's any, specific.
Yeah, I shouldn't have said there's no fixed time where it's too late, but I think when you looked at Tintin's, the way that they sort of culled the applications down to 7, you know, if you're looking at someone that's been a postdoc for a couple of years and has accomplished a certain amount, and someone's done it in a longer time, then there has to be a more significant accomplishment for the longer person.
I'd just like to add that some of these transition awards, so NIH has career transition awards to transition from postdoc to independent investigator, but David has received one of these. I think they have a cutoff of 3 to 5 years for how long you've been a postdoc.
Yeah, I think that's right. And yeah, Burroughs Welcome used to be, it's changed, that thing has changed around a lot. They used to be 4, and then they went to 3, and then back to 4.
But as an example, if you're applying for a Sloan Research Fellowship, they have in there that you should have received your PhD less than 5 years from the time of application. They'll give you, if you have a brand new award, you can apply the first year that you arrive at the institution, so it's been more years. But I think you're still at a disadvantage because you have to explain, well, it's been longer than 5 years, but I have an impact on your position.
Yeah, sorry.
So you said you applied to 70 places-ish around this time. Were they a big variety of types of institutions, or were they, you ended up at Johns Hopkins, is that right? Were they all similar to Johns Hopkins? It just
Oh, you
seems
couldn't
like,
find that many. Yeah.
that's what I was thinking. I'm like, there can't possibly be that many.
They're kind of
places.
across the board, more so than the year before when I was more localized. But in terms of, I mean, you have to factor in everything, like your constraints on location in the country or internationally, and then topic. And so I broadened the net a bit by whatever 40%.
What would you say were kind of the two extremes of places where you maybe ended up visiting or interviewing?
Oh, well, so I interviewed at, a pretty wide variety right off the bat. I mean, so I went to the University of Iowa, Iowa City, University of Alabama at Birmingham, the med school, and then Ohio State. So that's a huge public university. So it's pretty broad, and that kind of represents my net. I mean, I was. That's how it's going to look, basically. That's sort of a quasi-representative collection. But everyone's different. I mean, someone might want to be in med school, and they're only going to apply to med schools. So, or whatever, or colleges. I didn't apply to any colleges because I don't think I had the teaching experience really needed to get a job there. I mean, they probably require a year of full-time teaching experience, at least maybe some of them anyway.
So what's the minimum teaching experience?
think it highly depends on where it is. I mean, if it's a med school, it might not even be an issue. I would imagine they don't. I mean, your teaching load at a med school might be non-existent, I guess, or it might be very small, like 5 lectures a year. But at a place like Boulder, I imagine
But you do have
more is
experience
good, but-
before when you apply.
Yeah.
Yeah, you're talking about actual teaching, like, or, I mean, I think there's a broad spectrum of experience. Like, for example, in my case, I took the wonderful MCDB program on sort of the teaching and learning seminar. So that was a semester long, 1 or 2 hour per week class. And it's about active teaching, but we don't actually stand in front of a classroom other than that one in our experience. So that's something, and it's right here, it's great. In terms of actual teaching, like heading up a course or something that might be required for certain places that you apply to. I don't know how it differs in different fields. But
Well, I think you have to, it depends, like you said, on where you're applying, but you have to do something that distinguishes yourself. So if you're applying at a college, they're going to expect you probably to give a practice lecture, and that additional teaching experience is going to help. So they know that you can handle 2 or 3 courses a semester. Here, I would say most of the people we hire have little or no teaching experience. We're basing it on research. And so I think what you said is right. I mean, it just depends on what you're applying to.
I have no experience.
People we hire have almost no teaching experience.
But if they had some, it would probably help. Right? It can only help if they have both good research and plans and some teaching experience, I would imagine.
Well, I used this term when I was speaking, and we sometimes, we probably shouldn't say this, but we'll have someone that's a wonderful research and they give a colloquium and it's completely pitched at the wrong level. And so we sort of refer to it in the department as a career-ending injury, like athletics. Because, person works really hard to give a talk, but you come out thinking, well, this is pitched at the wrong level, people are really unhappy. And then it becomes a hard case, even though you might be brilliant in your specific type of creative work or research. It's just that people think, well, I don't think that person knows how to teach.
Any final questions for any of our speakers? Let's give David and John